Norbert's voice cut through the living room air, venomous and loud. "You won't take what's mine, Anthony. This woman and this land have an owner." He pointed a trembling finger at Helen, who flinched, hugging her daughter tightly. Anthony moved, positioning himself between them, his body rigid like a wall. "Lower that finger, Norbert. Your cowardice ends here." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with years of lies. Before we dive into this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us what town you're following us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. Even before the sun had fully shown its face over the hills of White Ridge, Anthony was already on his feet, a cup of bitter coffee in hand, watching the mist embrace his pastures. He was a man of few words and much land. Ever since his wife, Eliza, passed away 5 years ago, the mansion at Good Hope Ranch seemed to have grown, becoming emptier, and silence was his most constant companion. The hands respected him, perhaps even feared him a little. Anthony had a way of looking that seemed to peer into the depths of a person's soul, a serious gaze, heavy with memories he shared with no one. That morning, however, something broke the routine of his thoughts. His foreman, Joe Clancy, a trusted man who had been with his family for decades, arrived with his hat in hand, a little awkwardly. "Morning, boss. Sorry to bother you this early, but folks are talking." Anthony turned, his face impassive. "Talking about what, Joe Clancy?" "It's about the Fontes property, the one bordering us near the creek. Seems there are new folks there. They leased a piece of the land. A woman ... with a child." Anthony frowned. The Fontes property had been somewhat neglected since the old man passed. The heirs lived in the city and didn't give a damn about the place. "A woman alone?" he asked, his grave voice echoing in the spacious kitchen. "Not alone, no. They say there's an administrator, a certain Norbert, who handles things for the family. But the one doing the work, living in the caretaker's cottage, is this young woman. She arrived a few weeks ago, quiet, keeping to herself. Nobody really knows where she came from, for some reason." The news bothered Anthony. It wasn't his business, of course, but the image of a woman alone with a child, trying to scrape a living from tired land, stirred something within him. Perhaps it was the memory of Eliza, the fragility he saw in her. Or perhaps it was just the curiosity of a man accustomed to having control over everything around him. In the days that followed, the story of the new neighbor couldn't get out of his mind. He saw her from afar, a small figure, moving near the abandoned shed on the Fontes property. Once, mounted on his sorrel horse, he stopped at the fence that divided the properties. The pretext was to check a gate that had come loose, but his eyes were fixed on the scene on the other side. The woman, with a scarf on her head and a simple dress, was trying to fix a part of the roof of the small barn. Near her, a little girl about 4 or 5 years old was playing with a stick in the dirt. It was the child's laughter that struck him first, a clear, crystalline laugh that the wind carried to him and that for a second seemed incredibly familiar. Anthony felt a strange tightness in his chest, a sensation he couldn't name. It was almost a vertigo. He watched the woman turn to the girl, saying something he couldn't hear, but the gesture of her hand, tucking a strand of hair that had escaped her scarf, was enough. It was a trigger, a movement so particular, saw hers, that Anthony's breath caught in his throat. He knew that gesture. He knew her. The ground seemed to vanish beneath his horse's hooves. The woman who had vanished from his life without a trace, the young woman for whom he had almost thrown everything away, was there, just a few yards away, covered in dust and weariness. It was Helen, the same Helen, and yet different. Her face was thinner, marked by a hardness that life had surely imposed on her. But her eyes, when she raised her face to look at the sky, for an instant he saw. They were the same, two dark pools that had once drowned him in promises and dreams. Rage and relief battled within him. For 5 years he had wondered. For 5 years he had brooded over the abandonment, the lack of a letter, of a single word. And now she was there, as if time hadn't passed, and with a child. The girl with the crystalline laugh. The calculations in his head were quick and cruel. 5 years. The girl seemed to be exactly that age. Without a second thought, he dismounted, the sound of his boots on the dry earth drawing their attention. The little girl hid behind her mother's skirt, startled. Helen turned, her body tense, instinctively protecting her daughter. The sun hit her face, and when her eyes finally met his, Anthony saw recognition flicker and be immediately extinguished, replaced by a mask of cold politeness. "Good morning, sir. Do you need any help?" she said, her voice lower and hoarser than he remembered. "Sir." She called him sir, as if he were a complete stranger. That wounded him more than a slap. "The fence ... single quotes," he began, his voice rougher than he intended. "It looks like it gave way with the last rain. I came to see if it needed repair." It was the flimsiest excuse, but it was the only one he could find. "Ah, yes. I noticed. The administrator was supposed to send someone, but ... Single quotes, she let the sentence die in the air. A sigh from someone who no longer expected much. As he spoke, Anthony's eyes didn't stray from the little girl, who was now peeking from behind the folds of her mother's dress. She had straight brown hair, and her eyes were large and curious, like his. "Is she your daughter?" he asked, the question coming out direct, without beating around the bush. Helen stiffened. Her chin rose in a defensive posture he knew well. "Yes, her name is Leah. Leah, ... single quotes." He repeated the name, savoring it, testing it. "It's a beautiful name." The silence that settled between them was dense, laden with everything that couldn't be said. The morning breeze rustled the trees, but there, near the barbed wire fence, the air seemed still. Helen was about to say something, perhaps to politely send him away, when an affected, loud voice broke the moment. "Any trouble here, Mrs. Helen?" A man in a well-pressed shirt and riding breeches, which clearly had never seen mud up close, approached with long strides. It was Norbert, the administrator. He had an oily smile on his lips and an air of superiority that instantly irritated Anthony. "Colonel Anthony, what an honor. Your visit to our humble lands," Norbert said, extending his hand. Anthony squeezed it briefly, firmly, without taking his eyes off Helen. "I was just discussing ... with the lady." "About the fence," Anthony said, the word lady scraping in his throat. "Oh, don't you worry about that, Colonel. The upkeep of the Fontes property is entirely my responsibility. Helen here is just the tenant. She handles her part of the agreement," Norbert said, placing a possessive hand on Helen's shoulder, who subtly flinched at the touch. "She doesn't need to concern herself with men's business." The phrase was the last straw. The rage Anthony had been holding back boiled over. "From what I can see, the fence isn't the only thing that needs attention around here. The barn is falling apart, single quotes." Norbert's smile faltered. "We're on a ... tight budget, but everything will be resolved in due time. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have much to do." He practically herded Helen and Leah towards the small house, like a watchdog chasing away an unwelcome visitor. Helen cast one last glance at Anthony over her shoulder. A quick, almost indecipherable look. Was it fear, supplication, or just resignation? Anthony stood there, watching them walk away. The administrator was saying something in her ear, gesturing authoritatively. The rancher felt his blood boil. That man treated Helen like a possession, and she seemed trapped. He mounted his horse, his body heavy with impotent fury. He galloped back to Good Hope Ranch, but the image of Helen, thinner, more suffering, and that little girl with curious eyes wouldn't leave his mind. The silence of his mansion greeted him like a punch to the gut. That silence, which was once peace, was now a torment. He entered his study, a room lined with books and maps of his lands. On the desk, a silver photo frame held a picture of Eliza, his late wife, a sweet woman, of fragile health, whom he had loved with a calm and protective affection. But what he had felt for Helen, in those torrid months before she disappeared, was not calm. It had been a storm, a fire he thought had been extinguished by time. He was wrong. The ashes were still warm, and the question burning in his soul, stronger than the anger, more painful than the longing, was just one. Was that little girl Leah, his daughter? The answer to that question could change everything. It could give new meaning to that empty mansion, or destroy the little peace he had managed to build upon the ruins of his past. The days that followed were a slow torture for Anthony. He tried to occupy himself with work, with the ranch's accounting, with preparing for the coffee harvest, but his mind always returned to the other side of the fence. Every child's laugh the wind carried. Every glimpse of Helen's silhouette working under the strong sun was a constant reminder of what he had lost and what he might yet have. He couldn't get the way Norbert treated her out of his head. There was an arrogance, a tone of possession that left him on edge. He decided to find out more about the fellow. Joe Clancy, his foreman, was a discreet man, but with keen ears. One afternoon, while inspecting the cattle, Anthony asked, as if casually, "This Norbert ... from the Fontes property, was he from around here?" Joe Clancy spat out the toothpick he was chewing. "Nah, boss. He came with the young woman. He's a cousin to one of the heirs from the city. Folks say he's not worth the salt he eats. Thinks he owns the place, but everyone sees the young woman is the one working her fingers to the bone from sunup to sundown. They say he's always hounding her, controlling her every move." The information only confirmed what Anthony already suspected. That man was trouble, and Helen was in his hands. The need to protect her, an ancient and powerful instinct, began to speak louder than his wounded pride. He needed a pretext, a reason to go back there that wouldn't seem like an intrusion. The opportunity arose with the first heavy rains of the season. A part of the road that ran between the two properties became flooded, and the small, old, and weak gristmill on the Fontes property stopped working. It was the mill that ground the corn for the feed of Helen's few animals. Without it, she would have to buy feed in town, an expense that Anthony imagined she couldn't afford. The morning after the storm, he saddled his horse and took 2 of his best men with him. He crossed the gate of the Fontes property without asking permission. He found Helen near the creek, looking at the stopped mill with an expression of contained despair. Leah was sitting on a rock, drawing in the wet dirt. When she saw him, her face closed off. "Mr. Anthony, what are you doing here?" "The rain was heavy," he said, pointing with his chin to the mill. "I figured this might happen. I brought some men to take a look. We can get it running again." She shook her head, pride flickering in her eyes. "You don't need to bother, Ma. Norbert will take care of it." "Will he?" "By the state of things around here, it doesn't look like he cares much about upkeep," Anthony retorted, his voice firm, but without aggression. "Let me help, Helen. It's just a mill. A neighborly thing. He used her name on purpose. He wanted to break down that barrier of formality she insisted on maintaining. The sound of her own name seemed to disarm her for a second. Her shoulders dropped a little, and the exhaustion on her face became more evident. I can't accept. I have no way to pay. I'm not asking for payment." At that moment, Leah, who had been observing the conversation with her keen eyes, got up and walked shyly closer to Anthony. She looked at his horse, fascinated. "Is he yours?" the little girl asked, her thin voice breaking the tension. Anthony knelt down to her height, a genuine smile finally appearing on his face. "He is. His name is Thunder. Do you like horses?" Leah nodded, her eyes shining. "Mummy said one day we'll have one." Anthony's heart tightened. He looked at Helen, who was observing the scene with a mix of fear and tenderness. In that instant, interacting with the little girl, the suspicion that haunted him became a painful certainty in his chest. It was as if looking at Leah was looking into a mirror of his own past. "Well then," Anthony said, standing up and facing Helen, "my men are going to fix the mill. It's not a request." This time she didn't protest. She just nodded, a silent thank you in her tired eyes. While his men worked, Anthony remained there, under the pretext of supervising, but he was in fact stealing small moments. He observed the way Helen cared for Leah, the patience in her gestures, the unconditional love that overflowed from her. And he saw the little girl, running and playing, oblivious to all the drama surrounding her. Norbert appeared in the middle of the afternoon, his face red with rage. "What's the meaning of this? Who authorized this intrusion?" Anthony turned to him, the calm in his posture contrasting with the other's fury. "Just helping a neighbor. Something the administrator responsible for the property should have already done." The two men stared at each other, a silent battle waged under the afternoon sun. Norbert knew he couldn't confront Anthony on his own ground. The colonel was too powerful in the region. Swallowing hard, he disguised his anger with a false smile. "Well, of course. I appreciate the courtesy, Colonel. But next time just let me know. I like to keep things organized." He turned to Helen, the threat clear in his voice. "Don't you agree, Helen? You know how I like organization. Single quotes." Helen lowered her head, mumbling a yes. "Sir." The mill was working again by the end of the day. Anthony said goodbye with a nod of his head. As he mounted Thunder, he heard Leah's small voice. "Thank you, horseman." He smiled at her, a sad smile. That thank you weighed on his conscience. He wasn't doing it just out of kindness. He was drawing closer, breaking down Helen's defenses, seeking a truth he both feared and desired in equal measure. That night, the rain fell again, heavy and merciless. But in the mansion at Good Hope Ranch, the sound of the storm was muffled by the turmoil within Anthony. He was back in the game. Wounded pride gave way to a feeling of protection, of urgency. He didn't know what the future held, but of one thing he was certain. He wouldn't leave Helen and Leah alone in the hands of that scoundrel. And sooner or later, he would have his answer. The help with the mill opened a crack in the wall Helen had built around herself. Anthony didn't push it. On the contrary, he adopted a strategy of slow and careful approach. He passed by the property line every day on his morning rounds. He would accidentally run into her near the creek or the pasture. Their conversations were short, about the weather, about the land. He talked about the blight threatening the coffee plantation. She commented on the difficulty of making the garden thrive in that impoverished soil. Gradually, Helen began to lower her guard. Anthony's presence, once a threat to her fragile balance, became a point of stability. He didn't ask questions about the past. He didn't pressure her. He was just there, a solid and silent presence. and for a woman living under Norbert's constant surveillance and malicious comments, that discretion was a relief. Leah, on the other hand, had no such reservations. The little girl was enchanted by the horseman whenever she saw him. She would run to the fence, her little eyes sparkling with curiosity. "Did Thunder eat today?" she would ask. "Are you going to ride him in the rain?" Anthony always stopped to answer. He talked to the little girl with a patience he didn't even know he possessed. He told stories about the ranch animals, explained why cicadas sang before the rain, and in every conversation, in every smile from Leah, he saw himself. He saw his own way of frowning when he was concentrated, the same stubbornness in her gaze. Doubt transformed into an uncomfortable certainty, a truth he needed to hear from Helen's lips. One warm September afternoon, he found her mending the chicken coop fence. The sun was merciless, and she looked exhausted. He dismounted and tied the reins to a branch. "That's heavy work for one person," he said, picking up a hammer that was on the ground. "Someone has to do it," she replied, without stopping what she was doing, without looking at him. "Let me help." They worked side by side in silence. The only sound was the hammering on the wood. The sun beat on their backs, sweat ran down their faces. It was a strange intimacy, built on shared effort. "Why did you come back, Helen?" he asked suddenly, his voice low, almost a whisper. She stopped, the hammer suspended in the air. There were seconds of heavy silence. "I didn't come back here because of you, Anthony," she said, finally looking at him. There was an old hurt in her gaze. "I was born in this region. It's the only place I know. When things got difficult, I came back to the only ground I had." "Difficult how?" She shook her head, looking away. "That doesn't matter anymore. It matters to me," he insisted, his voice laden with an emotion he couldn't contain. "You vanished, Helen. Overnight. Without a word. Do you have any idea what I felt? And you? Do you have any idea what I felt?" she retorted, her voice choked. "You were the boss's son, engaged to another. What did you expect? That I would stay here, waiting for the crumbs of your time, being the other woman forever?" "I had my pride." Her words hit him hard. He remembered that time. He was promised to Eliza. An arranged marriage between families to unite land and power. And then Helen appeared, daughter of one of the caretakers, with her intense eyes and her smile that promised a different world. They lived a hidden, feverish love in the dark corners of the ranch, full of promises whispered under the moonlight. He had promised her he would break off the engagement, that he would confront his father, but he hesitated, and in his hesitation, she left. "I was going to break off the engagement," he said, his voice hoarse. "I just needed some time. The time you needed was the time I didn't have, Anthony," she said, tears finally streaming down her face. "Things happened, I had to leave. I had to make my own way. Alone." Her alone echoed between them. He looked in the direction of the small house, from where Leah's laughter came. The question was on the tip of his tongue, burning. But he didn't dare ask it. The fear of the answer was too great. At that moment, Norbert appeared, like a spectre. His face contorted into a mask of fury upon seeing the two so close, sharing a moment of intimacy. "Am I interrupting the lovebirds?" he asked, sarcasm dripping from every word. "Helen, I don't pay you to chat with the neighbors. We have work to do." He grabbed her arm forcefully. Anthony's instinct was to go for his throat. He took a step forward, his body tense. "Let her go, Norbert. And who's going to make me?" "You?" Norbert laughed, but there was a nervousness in his gaze. "You have nothing to do with what happens on this property. She works for me. No one works for you. And if you lay a hand on her again, ... single quotes. Anthony's threat hung in the air, more powerful than any shout. Norbert let her go, but pushed her towards the house. Go on. And you, Colonel, mind your own business and your own ranch. Leave mine alone. Anthony stood still, his heart pounding uncontrollably. He had crossed a line. That open confrontation with Norbert would have consequences. He knew that. But seeing the fear in Helen's eyes, he also knew he could no longer stand by, watching. He returned to his ranch feeling the bitter taste of helplessness. The conversation with Helen had opened old wounds, but it had also clarified some things. Her pride, her hurt. It all made sense. But the main piece of the puzzle was still missing. He needed to know the truth about Leah, and he needed to get Helen out of Norbert's clutches. The two things were intertwined, and he felt that time was running out to act. The administrator, wounded in his ego, wouldn't let that go unpunished. The silent war between the two ranches had just been declared. Anthony's affront left Norbert blind with rage. He couldn't openly challenge the colonel, but he could take out his fury on those within his reach. Helen's life, already difficult, became a living hell. Norbert began a silent and cruel campaign of sabotage. First, he delayed the transfer of the lease money, claiming bureaucratic problems with the heirs. Without that money, Helen couldn't buy seeds for the garden or basic supplies at the small general store in town. Then, he sold 2 of the few head of cattle she cared for, claiming the money was to cover unexpected expenses of the property. They were blatant lies, but she had no way to prove it. The worst, however, were the rumors. Norbert began to spread rumors in town that the new resident of the Fontes property was a woman of loose morals, trying to con the rich widower from the neighboring ranch. He insinuated that her daughter was of unknown parentage, the fruit of a dissolute life. Gossip ran rampant, and soon Helen began to feel the sidelong glances and whispers when she went to Sunday service or needed to go to the drugstore. Helen endured it all with her head held high. She was used to fighting, but the humiliation was draining her strength. She grew thinner, and the dark circles under her eyes deepened. The only light in her days was Leah, who, in her innocence, didn't perceive the malice surrounding them. Anthony saw the deterioration from afar and felt guilty. His interference had made things worse for her. He tried to help discreetly. He had Joel Clancy leave baskets of food and fruit at the gate, forgotten there by chance. He asked one of his ranch hands to check on her cattle, ensuring they didn't lack pasture or water. Helen knew the help came from him, and though her pride made her want to refuse, necessity spoke louder. One morning, Anthony saw something that made his blood run cold. Norbert was yelling at Helen near the road. From afar, he couldn't hear the words, but he saw the aggressive gestures, the finger jabbed in her face. Helen was cowering, protecting Leah, who was crying, frightened. He didn't think. He spurred thunder, and in a few seconds he was there, the horse rearing abruptly, startling Norbert. "What's the problem here?" Anthony's voice was low and dangerous. Norbert composed himself, trying to maintain his composure. "Private matter, Colonel. Between me and my ... employee. Since when do you settle private matters by yelling at a woman and a child in the middle of the road?" Anthony dismounted, his height and physical presence diminishing Norbert. "I heard the shouting from my porch. What's going on?" This woman is accusing me of theft," Norbert said, indignant. "Just because I sold 2 cows to pay the ranch's bills. She's ungrateful." "I didn't accuse anyone," Helen said, her voice trembling but firm. "I just asked where the money went, because the chicken feed ran out, and you said you couldn't afford to buy more." Anthony looked at Norbert. contempt etched on his face. You sold her cattle to pay bills you yourself should be covering. And you still have the nerve to humiliate her in front of her daughter. He approached Helen and knelt in front of Leah, who was still sobbing. Hey, little one, don't cry. It's over. Don't cry. It's over. Tear from the girl's face with his thumb. The gesture was so natural, so paternal, that it hurt Helen's chest. Leah, instead of being frightened, hugged Anthony's neck. A spontaneous embrace from a child seeking protection. For Anthony, that hug was like a verdict. He smelled her hair, the warmth of her small body against his, and he knew with certainty. There was no longer any doubt in his heart. He stood up, holding Leah's hand. He looked at Helen and then at Norbert. This ends today. He turned to Helen. Pack your things. You two are coming with me. You'll stay at Good Hope Ranch. Helen's eyes widened in panic. No, I can't. What will people say? To hell with people, he exploded. Do you prefer to stay here, being humiliated and threatened by this coward, out of fear of what others will think? You and your daughter won't spend another night under the same roof as him. You can't do this, Norbert shouted. She has a contract. She can't just leave. Test me, Norbert, Anthony said, his gaze cold as steel. Try to stop her, and we'll see what happens. Do you think the Fontes heirs will like to know how their trusted administrator is treating the property and the people here? Norbert paled. He knew Anthony had enough influence to ruin him with a single phone call. He backed away, defeated and humiliated. Helen was paralyzed, torn between fear and relief. Going to Anthony's ranch was admitting defeat, placing herself under the protection of the man she loved and who had hurt her. It was fueling all the gossip Norbert had spread. But staring meant continuing to live in that nightmare. She looked at Leah, who was still holding Anthony's hand tightly, as if he were an anchor in the storm. Her daughter's safety came first, always. With a sigh of surrender, she looked at Anthony. We don't have many things. Grab the essentials. Joe Clancy will come for the rest later, he ordered, already in control of the situation. While Helen went into the small house to gather her few clothes and Leah's toys into a canvas bag, Anthony remained outside, the little girl's hand still in his. He looked at the horizon, at his lands that stretched vast and prosperous. He had that entire empire, but his mansion was empty. Now he was bringing within his walls the woman who haunted his thoughts and the child who, he was certain, was his own flesh and blood. He didn't know what living together would be like, how he would explain it to his employees, to the town's society. But for the first time in 5 years, the future seemed less grey. The storm was just beginning, but there, holding that little one's hand, he felt he finally had a reason to fight. Helen and Leah's arrival at Good Hope Ranch caused a quiet stir. The staff, led by the housekeeper, Mrs. Dieter, an old woman who had seen Anthony born, watched the scene with a mix of surprise and curiosity. No woman, besides distant relatives, had set foot in the mansion since Mrs. Eliza's death, and now the boss, always so reserved, arrived with a humble-looking woman and a child by the hand. Anthony acted with a naturalness that surprised everyone, including himself. Dieter, prepare the upstairs guest room, the one with the garden view. It's for Helen and Leah. His voice brooked no questions. More's Dieter. A woman of few words and much wisdom, simply nodded. She cast a quick glance at Helen, a look that wasn't judgmental, but evaluative. She saw the weariness on the young woman's face, the dust of the road on her clothes, and the protective way she held her daughter's hand. And she also saw the change in the boss. There was a different light in his eyes, a determination she hadn't seen in a long time. Helen felt like a fish out of water. The mansion was immense, with its dark wood furniture, gleaming polished floors, and an imposing silence. Everything there spoke of wealth and tradition, a world that wasn't hers. She felt like an intruder, the main character of the gossip Norbert had stirred up. I can stare in the back room. You don't need to bother ... single quotes, she murmured to Anthony as they climbed the wide staircase. You are not a servant, Helen. You are my guest, he replied, firm. And you will stay in the best room. The room was larger than her entire small house. It had a huge bed with white, embroidered sheets, a wooden dressing table, and tall windows that opened onto a well-kept garden. Leah ran to the window, her eyes wide. Look, Mummy, so many flowers. For the first time in days, Helen saw a genuine smile on her daughter's face that calmed a part of her distressed heart. Perhaps, just perhaps, she had done the right thing. The forced cohabitation began strangely and full of unspoken things. Anthony had his meals at the large dining room table and insisted that Helen and Leah sit with him. In the first few days, the silence was almost palpable. Helen barely touched her food, tense under the discreet glances of the servants waiting at the table. Leah, for her part, adapted with the ease of children. She was enchanted by the ranch dogs, made friends with the cook's daughter, and soon treated the mansion as her private playground. It was Leah, unknowingly, who began to break the ice. Her incessant questions and contagious joy filled the silence of the house. Uncle Anthony, why does the hen cackle after laying an egg? She would ask during lunch. Because she's proud, Leah. Telling everyone she did a good job, he would reply, and a small smile would appear on his lips. Helen watched these interactions with a heavy heart. She saw the way Anthony looked at Leah, a mixture of affection and deep pain. He was seeing, she knew. He was putting the pieces together, and the fear that he would ask the question she dreaded kept her constantly on edge. One night, after Leah was already asleep, Helen went down to the kitchen for a glass of water. She found Anthony on the porch, looking at the starry sky, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Can't sleep?" he asked, without turning. "A little," she admitted, stopping beside him. The scent of jasmine from the garden filled the night. "She looks like you," he said suddenly, his voice grave. "She has your smile." Helen felt a shiver. "She's a very joyful little girl. But she has my eyes," he continued, turning to face her. The moonlight illuminated half of his face, leaving the other half in shadow. "When she's angry or concentrating, she frowns the same way I do. The same way my father used to frown." Helen's heart pounded. It was now. The question would come. "Anthony, single quotes," she began, her voice failing. "You don't have to say anything," he interrupted her, surprising her. "I won't force you to say what you don't want to. Not now." He took a sip of his drink, his gaze lost in the darkness. "When you left, I married Eliza. I tried to be a good husband. I tried to forget you. But she couldn't have children. It was her dream to be a mother. An illness took her before I could give her that joy." The confession caught her by surprise. She never knew the details, only that he had married, as everyone expected. "I'm so sorry, Anthony. I didn't know." "I know," he said, his voice full of an old sorrow. "For 5 years this house was a tomb. The silence, the empty corridors, and now ... Now I hear her laughter echoing everywhere. It's strange. It hurts. But it's a good kind of pain. Do you understand?" Helen understood. She understood his loneliness, the hunger for life that Leah's presence had awakened, and she felt a pang of guilt. The secret she guarded so fiercely wasn't just hers, it belonged to him too. One day I'll tell you everything," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I'll wait," he replied. That moment on the porch changed something between them. The tension gave way to a fragile complicity. They began to talk more. He told her about the challenges of the ranch. She spoke about the dreams she had for Leah. Restrained gestures became more frequent. A hand that accidentally touched when he passed her the sugar bowl. A gaze that lingered a second longer across the dinner table. The fire they had tried to extinguish was slowly being rekindled by the ashes of the past. But the peace was fragile. On the other side of the fence, Norbert wasn't idle. Wounded in his pride and consumed by envy, he planned his revenge. And he knew that the best way to strike Anthony was to use the powerful rancher's only apparent vulnerability. Helen and the secret she kept. The news that the tenant of the Fuentes property was living in the main house of Good Hope Ranch spread through the town of White Ridge like wildfire. The gossip Norbert had sown now had fertile ground to flourish. In conversations outside the church, at the drugstore counter, sharp tongues spared no one. They said Helen was a gold digger, that she had seduced the rich widower, that she was taking advantage of his grief. Anthony ignored the whispers with calculated indifference. He was the most powerful man in the region. No one would dare confront him directly. But Helen felt the weight of every sidelong glance, every muffled giggle when she passed by. She, who had always valued her dignity, was now seen as an adventuress. To protect her, Anthony insisted that she used a ranch car instead of walking to town. But this only made things worse, confirming to the gossips that she was living it up, within the walls of Good Hope Ranch. However, a new routine was established. Helen, unable to sit idle, began to help. She tended the garden with a care that charmed Mrs. Dieter. She reorganized the dusty library. Her presence brought life and a feminine touch to the mansion that had long smelled of longing. Leah, for her part, flourished. Free from the heavy atmosphere of the other property, she became an even more radiant child. She spent her days running through the pastures with the employees' children, learning to milk cows with Joe Clancy, and following Anthony like a shadow. "Uncle Anthony, what's that?" she would ask, pointing to the coffee dryer. And he, with infinite patience, explained the entire process, from the bean on the plant to the steaming cup. He would place her on Thunder and take her for short rides around the property. In those moments, the joy on Leah's face was so pure it disarmed anyone. Helen watched from afar, her heart torn between the happiness of seeing her daughter so well and the growing fear of the bond forming between her and Anthony. One late afternoon, as the setting sun painted the sky orange, Helen found Anthony in the barn, watching the milking. "She adores you," Helen said, her voice soft. Anthony smiled, without taking his eyes off Leah, who was trying, unsuccessfully, to pet a skittish calf. "The feeling is mutual. She brightens everything." He turned to Helen, his gaze serious. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. What does Norbert have against you? His anger isn't just because I brought you here. It's something older, more personal." Helen sighed, her expression hardening at the sound of his name. "When I arrived here, with nothing, Norbert was the one who helped me. He arranged the lease with his cousins. But his help always came with a price. From the beginning he harassed me." The confession came out with difficulty. It was insinuations, invitations to dinner in town, a touch on my arm that lingered too long. I always refused. always pretended not to understand. I think he thought that, with time, hardship would make me yield. When you appeared ... and showed interest ... he went mad. It wasn't about me, Anthony. It was about his ego. He couldn't stand being rejected and seeing another man, especially you, have my attention. The rage in Anthony's eyes was palpable. His fists clenched tightly. That bastard. If I had known this ... single quotes, you would have done something foolish, she cut him off. And it would have been worse for me. I know how to take care of myself, Anthony. I learned to be strong. You don't need to be strong alone anymore, Helen, he said, his voice full of contained emotion. He took a step towards her, the space between them shrinking. He could feel her scent, the warmth emanating from her skin. Stay here, with me. The request wasn't about temporary shelter. It was an invitation for something more, a new beginning. Helen's heart pounded erratically. It was everything she wanted most and everything she feared most. Staying meant confronting the past, revealing her secret. It meant risking her heart once again. Before she could answer, Norbert's voice, full of false triumph, sounded behind them. What a touching scene. The happy family reunited. Anthony and Helen turned, surprised. Norbert stood at the entrance to the barn, a poisonous smile on his face. Beside him, an older man in a suit and tie watched the scene with disapproval. Dr. Richard, this is Colonel Anthony. And this, he said, pointing at Helen with contempt, is the woman I told you about. Anthony recognized the man. It was Richard Fontes, one of the heirs of the neighboring property, an influential lawyer from the city. What do you want here, Norbert? Anthony asked, subtly positioning himself in front of Helen. I just came to accompany Dr. Richard. It seems he received some serious complaints about property invasion and ... kidnapping of a tenant and her daughter, Norbert said, savoring every word. Richard Fontes stepped forward, his face serious. Colonel Anthony, I respect your standing in this region. But you have no right to invade my property and take away a person who has a contract with us. Mrs. Helen needs to return to the property immediately. And as for the girl ... Norbert told me a very troubling story. A story about that child's paternity. A story that might be of great interest to certain people. The veiled threat hung in the air, heavy and cold. Norbert wasn't just trying to take Helen back. He was using the doubt about Leah's paternity as a weapon. A weapon pointed directly at Anthony's heart and at Helen's deepest secret. The war had emerged from the shadows. Now it would be fought there, in the middle of the barn, with the fate of all three at stake. Anthony's world seemed to spin. Norbert's threat was low, cowardly, and struck his most vulnerable point, Leah's paternity. Exposing that publicly would be a scandal that would not only tarnish his name, but, more importantly, Helen's and the girl's lives forever. What are you talking about, Norbert? Anthony growled, the dangerous calm in his voice being the only thing that held back his urge to pounce on him. Oh, Colonel, Norbert said with a cynical smile, I'm talking about the truth. A truth this woman has been hiding for 5 years. Tell him, Helen. Tell your protector who your daughter's father is. Or better yet, tell Dr. Richard. Perhaps he'll be interested to know what kind of people he shelters on his property. Helen was pale as wax. Her legs trembled, and she gripped Anthony's arm to keep from falling. Her eyes were fixed on Norbert, full of dread and hatred. Richard Fontes, the lawyer, looked from one to the other, his face heavy with suspicion. Madam, what my cousin is insinuating is very serious. If you have abandoned your contractual obligations and are here under false pretenses ... single quotes. She is not here under false pretenses. Anthony interrupted, his voice reverberating through the barn. She is here, under my protection, because your administrator was harassing and threatening her. You should be ashamed, Richard, to let a man like that manage what's yours. That's your word against his, the lawyer retorted, clearly siding with his cousin. What I have concretely is that the madam abandoned the property. I demand that she return. And as for the girl, single quotes, at that moment, Leah, who was playing nearby and sensed the tension, ran to them. Mummy, what's wrong? Why is the bad man here? She clung to Helen's leg, looking at Norbert with fear. The child's presence changed the atmosphere. It made everything more real, more painful. Enough, Helen said, her voice surprisingly strong. She let go of Anthony and took a step forward, facing the two men. You want me to go back? For what? To live on scraps, being humiliated every day. For this man to continue circling me like a vulture. I'm not going back. I'm not leaving here. You have no choice, Norbert shouted. You have a contract. And what are you going to do? Drag me back by force? She challenged, desperation giving her a courage she didn't even know she possessed. Anthony placed a hand on Helen's shoulder, a gesture of support. She's not going anywhere. And if you try anything, Norbert, you'll answer to me. Not by the law of men, but by my law. Richard Fontes felt the weight of the threat. He knew Anthony's reputation. A just man, but relentless when provoked. He hesitated, looking at his cousin, who seemed to have lost control of the situation. This isn't over, Norbert said, through clenched teeth. If she won't go willingly, maybe the truth will make her. I'll tell everyone, Helen. I'll spread it to every corner of this town that you had a child with a married man and then ran away to hide your shame. It was the final blow, the revelation he threatened to make. But to everyone's surprise, Helen didn't collapse. She took a deep breath, looked at Leah, who was watching her with wide eyes, and then turned to Anthony. There was a resolution in her gaze. A decision that had just been made. No, she said, her voice clear and firm. You won't tell anything, because I will. She turned completely to Anthony, ignoring the other two. Her eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of weakness. They were tears of a mother willing to do anything to protect her child. I ran away, Anthony. It's true. I ran away because I found out I was pregnant. And you were engaged to be married. I didn't want to be the scandal, the mistress who destroyed a family. I didn't want my daughter to be born with that mark. So I left. To protect you. To protect her. Every word was a confession that tore at her soul, but also freed her from a burden she had carried for 5 long years. I never had another man, Anthony. Never. Anthony's world stopped. The suspicion, the silent certainty, was now a truth spoken aloud. The air left his lungs. He looked at Leah, who was staring at him with her big, curious eyes. His daughter. He had a daughter. The emotion that overwhelmed him was immense. A mixture of joy, pain, anger for the lost time, and a love so intense it almost suffocated him. He took a step towards Helen, his hand outstretched, his face transfigured. Norbert and Richard watched the scene, shocked by the public confession. Norbert's plan had backfired spectacularly. He wanted to humiliate Helen, but instead he set her free. He wanted to use the truth as a weapon, but the truth became the link that would finally unite Anthony and Helen. My daughter, single quotes, Anthony whispered, his voice choked. He knelt in front of Leah, his eyes welling up. He didn't know what to say, what to do. He just looked at her, trying to imprint every detail of that face that was a part of him. Leah, not understanding the complexity of the moment. simply saw the emotion in the eyes of the man she had grown to like. With the pure intuition of children, she touched his face. "Don't cry, Uncle Anthony." That touch, that innocent plea, broke Anthony's last barrier. The tears he had held back for 5 years, the pain of Eliza's loss, the loneliness, the anguish of doubt, all came to the surface. He embraced the little girl, a father's hug, a hug that had waited 5 years to happen. The climax was not one of confrontation, but of complete emotional surrender. There, on the barn floor, under everyone's gaze, a new family was born amidst the ruins of the past. Anthony and Leah's embrace, right there in the middle of the barn, was a watershed moment. Time seemed to stop. For Norbert and Richard Fontes, the scene was the embodiment of their defeat. The truth, which they thought would be a bomb to destroy everything, had in fact built an unshakable fortress before their very eyes. Richard, the lawyer, was the first to realize there was nothing more to be done there. He pulled his cousin by the arm, muttering, "Let's go, Norbert. It's over." Norbert still tried to protest, but the look Anthony shot him over his daughter's shoulder was so laden with a promise of retribution that he fell silent and let himself be led away, vanishing like the cowardly shadow he always was. When they were gone, a deep silence settled, broken only by Anthony's choked sobs. Helen approached and knelt beside them, touching his back. It was a gesture of comfort, of forgiveness, of a new beginning. Leah, between the two, looked from one to the other, sensing the magnitude of the moment without understanding it. "He's your daddy, my love," Helen whispered to her daughter, her voice choked. Leah looked at Anthony, who was now gazing at her with a tear-stained smile. "Daddy?" She tested the word, and then a huge smile broke across her face. "I have a daddy." That night, the main house at Good Hope Ranch was different. It was no longer a place of silence and sad memories. There was laughter at the dinner table. There was a little girl, animatedly telling how her new daddy had put her on the tallest horse in the world. There was a man who couldn't take his eyes off his daughter, as if trying to make up for 5 years of absence in every glance. And there was a woman watching it all, her heart finally at peace. After Leah fell asleep, exhausted from so many emotions, Anthony and Helen sat on the porch, just like that other night. But now there were no more secrets between them. "You should have told me, Helen," he said, his voice soft, without any hint of accusation. "We lost so much time. I was afraid," she confessed. "Afraid of ruining your life, afraid of being judged, afraid you wouldn't believe me. I chose the path I thought was right at the time, to protect Leah from everything. You are the strongest woman I know," he said, taking her hand. Their fingers intertwined, a perfect fit, as if they had always belonged to each other. "But now you don't have to be strong alone anymore. I am here, for both of you, forever." He pulled her close and kissed her. It wasn't a feverish, stolen kiss like those of their youth, but a calm, deep kiss, full of promises and the certainty of someone who had finally found their place in the world. The following weeks were transformative. Anthony used his influence to resolve Helen's situation with the Fonte family. He bought out the lease contract and then made a generous offer for the entire property. Richard Fontes, embarrassed and wanting to get rid of the problem Norbert had created, accepted without hesitation. The Fontes property was incorporated into the lands of Good Hope Ranch, and Anthony's first act as the new owner was to fire Norbert, who vanished from the region without a trace. The news of Colonel Anthony's happy ending spread, and the same people who gossiped now sighed over the story of rediscovered love. White Ridge, like any small town, quickly adapted to the new truths. Gradually, Anthony, Helen, and Leah became a family. They had picnics in the pastures, fished in the creek, and filled the mansion's corridors with the sound of a happiness that seemed to have been delayed by fate. Anthony taught Leah to ride a horse, and Helen taught Anthony to laugh again, to laugh with his whole body as he hadn't done since his youth. One Sunday morning, the three of them were at the highest point of the ranch, from where they could see the entire expanse of their lands. The morning sun bathed the green fields, and the world seemed full of promises. "Look, Daddy," Leah said, pointing to the horizon. "You can see the whole world from here." Anthony picked her up, hugging her tightly. He looked at Helen, who stood beside him, and the love he felt for them was as vast as the landscape before him. He had been a man rich in land, but poor in affection. Now, he had the greatest of all treasures. "It's true, my daughter," he said, his voice full of a serene emotion. "You can see our whole world." They stood there, the three of them together, watching the dawn of a new life, built on the foundations of an old love, resilient as the land they stood upon, and finally, complete. Did this story move you? Each chapter was designed to touch the heart and make us reflect on forgiveness, new beginnings, and the strength of love. If you've made it this far, it's because this journey was also yours. Don't keep this emotion all to yourself. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming narratives. Leave a like so this message reaches more people, and most importantly, comment below which part resonated with you the most. Your participation is what brings all of this to life. A big hug, and until the next story.